Daniel, did you come all the way back to Colorado the day before Thanksgiving to record this podcast?
I just love talking to you that much, Dan.
Oh, that is just so heartwarming. I am thankful that you love talking to me that much.
Yeah, I had to get the steps in, so.
There you go. What are we talking about today?
Well, I came all the way back from New Jersey to talk about the value of alternative investments, the considerations of early retirement planning, and actually planning for long-term care.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, I mean that's a pretty healthy roster. Let's hit it. Shall we start with alts?
I would love that. So I'm taking my investments class for the CFP curriculum right now, and there's a whole section about alternative investments, right? They speak about portfolio diversification, the potential for higher returns, a hedge against inflation. So some examples of alternative investments that they're talking about include things like commodities. So think maybe gold, silver, oil, collectibles, art, wine, luxury watches, real estate. So investments in land, commercial property, and even like real estate investment trusts. It's a pretty big section of one chapter. I'd find it hard to believe they're just something we don't talk about with clients at all or implement. But I wanted to put it to you. What's the deal here?
Well, so they're considered alts, or they're classified as alts because the core of financial markets really revolves around equity and debt issues, right? Equity, common stock, ownership of companies, publicly traded companies. So your Apple, your Microsoft, et cetera, fixed income, loans to the government, loans to municipalities, loans to these private companies or these publicly traded companies. And then the derivative common financial products like mutual funds, ETFs, those sorts of things. And so when we talk about commodities, whether it's gold and silver, whether we talk about tangible assets like art or decorations or things like music rights, or licensing rights, anything that doesn't really fall into that core demographic of financial securities gets considered an alt. And it's such a giant category that I'm actually sort of surprised that they are using, and maybe you're just paraphrasing, right? But talking about like the touted benefits of this, I think diversification is obvious because they are a different type of asset, and therefore there's a degree of diversification in just having different types of assets. When we talk about potential for higher returns or a hedge against inflation, I start to get a little bit skeptical because not all alts share these characteristics.
All right, so it sounds like just a basket of catch-all things that aren't maybe equities or fixed income securities. One of the big ones I'm hearing a lot, though, is gold. Even yesterday, I went out to dinner and was sitting by myself at the bar. Two guys next to me talking about how gold's been killing it recently, and especially with the dollar maybe losing value relative to other currencies, gold can be a really great way to hedge against that risk and diversify a portfolio. We don't talk about gold a ton on the podcast here, but how are your feelings about, gold is, a small part of somebody's portfolio to hedge some of these risks?
I mean, the research on gold is not actually that bullish. So take it with a bit of a grain of salt. I think there was a really good Journal of Financial Planning article from a couple of years ago. I think we referenced it, probably like 20, 30 episodes ago. But, there was a really good study done on gold that essentially shows that it's effectively no better or worse than sort of like money markets when it comes to its return. Like it really tends to yield something closer to inflation on a very long-term basis. Its characteristic as a hedge against inflation really is only effective insofar as it's a hedge against hyperinflation. And the way that sort of takes effect is that, gold, at least tangible gold, right? Because there's gold-based securities, gold ETFs, gold mutual funds, but, tangible gold, its ability to hedge against inflation is really more of a protection against hyperinflation in that, let's say, the dollar, goes crazy. We suddenly have like Argentina level inflation. You could then potentially take your tangible gold and sell it in a place like Great Britain for pounds or somewhere in the EU, for euros. And as long as those currencies haven't gone through hyperinflation, then that's preserved some of its value. But otherwise, the face value of gold tends to be derived from just the market demand for the tangible asset, which rises and falls with, actual uses of gold for jewelry, technology, that sort of thing. And then more particularly based on sort of consumer investment market sentiment, where people get paranoid about things and they rush to gold as a quote unquote safe haven. You see a similar argument for crypto. The irony being both gold and crypto tend to be highly correlated to the stock market in a general sense. Gold a little bit less so, but like crypto is super sensitive to the stock market. So it's sort of ironic that you have these things that are supposed to be inflation hedges, market hedges, and they're not very good at it.
Okay, that sounds like you're talking about maybe specifically physical gold. What about some of these things I can purchase, through my custodian in my investment portfolio?
Well, it's going to track to the face value of gold. The problem is that doesn't hedge your hyperinflation factor so much because they're going to redeem that fund in dollars. So, unless the dollar value of the fund has, relatably changed in terms of the, underlying value of tangible gold, unless you can get a fund company to exchange the gold value for the equivalent, British sterling or whatever it is, you're going to run into an issue where, the fact that you bought a gold product means you're going to get the face value of gold. But if it's going to be refunded to you in a hyperinflation environment, just the act of exchanging it into US dollars and then trying to convert those dollars into a different currency could incur some pretty significant exchange rate problems.
And the funny thing there is, if I put myself in a scenario in which the dollar loses a considerable amount of value and I have gold just stacked up in a safe somewhere, I think I'm going to have bigger issues and bigger concerns than let me trade this gold in exchange for something else. I think I'm going to be worried more about how am I going to pay for groceries or pay for my rent or keep my job. I'm not really sure my first priority is going to be, taking advantage of this gold that I've been stashing for a period of time.
I mean, it's interesting, too, because you'll sometimes hear people talk about, gold coins, silver coins, et cetera, as being like an apocalypse hedge. But then, if it's really for the apocalypse, don't you want food, water, filtration, guns, ammo, fuel, generators, things that are going to keep you alive in the apocalypse, not just what you hope somebody will trade their food for? I always find that a little bit strange. I'm also maybe surprised here. I thought maybe our conversation would focus a little bit more on the recent proposals to introduce more private equity and alternative assets into things like 401k plans. Is that something you wanted to discuss as well?
Yeah. I mean, gold is something that, especially just yesterday, I was hearing about it in a local setting, so I figured it was worth touching on. But yeah, I've been hearing a lot about this, alternative investment space being brought into qualified retirement plans through, somebody's 401k through work or maybe an IRA outside of their current employer. Kind of sounds like a halfway decent idea for some of the people that may be a little bit more inclined to take on risk. But I know that that's not the case, and everything has trade-offs. How do you feel about, that being a proposal? I mean, I can see a big issue being people just having a lack of literacy about what that actually means, seeing the potential for higher returns and not realizing on the downside it could mean really negative consequences for something like retirement as well. How do you feel?
You think your jersey's coming out there a little bit, but otherwise, I think it's interesting because I think when people invest in the broad stock market, they buy an S&P 500 index fund or they buy a total aggregate bond fund or something like that, I think there's this underlying snuck premise that most of us have, which is, the market can definitely gain or lose a lot of value, but it's not like every company in the world is going to fold, right? Or every debt issue is going to go into default and not going to get repaid. And that's a really important distinction to consider because when you look at something like, investing in the S&P 500 or the U.S. total stock market, whatever it is, you understand you could lose some money, but I think you subconsciously think to yourself, but I'll never lose it all, right? If it's a downturn, it'll be temporary. That's not the case in the world of private equity and alts. Certain things like gold is going to maintain some degree of value in perpetuity because it has real world tangible applications. Same with lumber, wheat, coffee, etc. But on the other side of that, in something like private equity or, real estate alts or these different private syndication things, there is a real chance that it could go to zero because you're not typically investing in tried and true, well-established institutions. you're investing in startups. You're investing in, private business offerings or syndicated collections of small businesses that are not otherwise traded on the total stock market or in the kind of the broader world of equities. And so, unlike investing in the S&P 500, where you can definitely lose a lot of money, but you can have a pretty decent confidence that the 500 largest companies in the world are not all going to go bankrupt, that's not the case in the world of alts and private equity. And I think, the proposal here is, well, there's a lot of money made in the world of private equity, and therefore it's valuable. Or you see arguments that it's less volatile, which are actually fictitious. But, there's a real risk that people could actually lose 100% of their investment in the private equity world, because that is actually the norm, not the exception, right? The average private equity investment loses money, generally speaking. It's only kind of the exceptional or the well-managed rare offerings that tend to actually provide those excess returns that people tend to look for.
That's such a good point, right? Something like the S&P, like you said, even if there is a temporary market decline, it's not a permanent loss of your capital. That is not the case with something like private equity or some of these alternatives in which the norm is for them to lose money, and more likely than not, they might go to zero. And that's super risky. Do you think there's any place for them in qualified plans?
Personally, you're king for a day. No. I don't think retirement is where you should be doing aggressive speculation. And it'd be one thing if you said we're going to permit, 5% or 10% of your retirement account balance to be invested in this category, similar to how some retirement plans will permit a certain percentage of your account to be invested in like a brokerage window through Fidelity or something like that, where you can invest in anything on the Fidelity platform instead of just the 10, 15 funds that are in your plan's lineup. But I mean, the proposals here are just like, hey, if we want to introduce private equity funds into the 401k plan, then participants can invest 100% of their balance in it. And that, I think, is a highly risky, highly kind of suspect activity. I also look at sort of the element of who is pushing for this, and it is the private equity companies themselves. And obviously, they stand to make money by getting more investment dollars. But part of the world of private equity that doesn't exist so much in the public markets is sometimes there's a substantial degree of information asymmetry. Public markets, you have a lot of disclosure rules and requirements where essentially it's very hard for publicly traded companies or funds that focus on publicly traded securities to obscure what they hold, what they're doing, et cetera. But that doesn't exist in the private equity world. So not only do you have a much higher risk-reward profile, you also have a greater degree of sophistication required to effectively invest in this marketplace. And frankly, what I think is going to happen is a lot of retail investors are going to turn into exit liquidity for better informed investors who are going to get out of these investments early before they go sour and leave a lot of retail investors holding the bag.
That's a really good point, right? We all have access more or less to the same public information for the majority of things in our portfolio. That is not the case here. So why do you think private equity is lobbying to kind of get these investments pushed into some of these retirement plans for folks like me and you?
Well, I mean, again, there's that potential risk of exit liquidity, but also, finance is in some respects a zero-sum game. There's a limited amount of money in the world at any given time. All of these companies make their money based on how much money is invested in them in the first place. And if you're restricted from accessing one of the largest marketplaces, i.e. ERISA plans like 401k, 403b, 457 plans, it is in your financial interest to get access to that marketplace. That marketplace has been well protected by ERISA, the law that sort of governs all these types of plans for a long time, that really requires plan sponsors to perform substantial due diligence on the investments offered to their employees and makes them liable when those investments are poorly managed or are too expensive or otherwise bad. But essentially the idea here is you could always potentially have private equity in these funds. There just wasn't a safe harbor for that due diligence. And most plan sponsors lack the support, the tools, or the mechanisms, not only to do the due diligence, but also then to absorb the risk of offering those high-risk investments to their employees. And so really the push here is to try to create some carve-outs and safe harbors for these types of investments. So that way, the plan sponsors can feel quote-unquote safe offering them to their employees. And I come around on all of this. I mean, like, perfect example, we had a conversation with a client earlier this week who, essentially has made, personal private investments in things that are essentially private equity in the real estate world and is facing essentially a total loss on these. I mean, we're talking about several $100,000. And the good news is they have enough money to absorb these losses. These are investments that they made before working with us, where if they'd asked our opinion, we would have been like, I don't know that's a very good idea. But, I mean, they're faced with losing several $100,000 and not getting that money back at this point. And that is a potential reality in introducing private equity into something like your 401k or your pension plan.
Yeah, completely agree. Do you think employers should be wary and maybe decline or opt out of including these options to protect their employees?
I would go so far as to say almost unequivocally, yes, they should avoid offering these to their employees. I think this is also a category similar to like permanent life insurance, where I don't think a lot of employers are going to rush out there to offer it. I think a lot of 401k plans or vendors for 401k plans who are in the business of selling products or who receive greater compensation based on the fund lineup are going to potentially be the people pushing this, right? Like, I don't think, Joe's, coffee shop down the street is going to be looking to add private equity to the 401k plan. But I think Joe's coffee shop that's advised by a broker from a wirehouse that makes money when the plan offers these types of investments is going to have an advisor out there or a broker out there suggesting that they introduce these types of investments into their plan. I think it's very unlikely that the average employee of the average business in the United States is going to be clamoring and demanding that their boss start offering these private equity investments in the same way that, you don't see a huge amount of demand for crypto investments in these plans from the participants, but you see a lot of people in the crypto business trying to get crypto investments put into these plans.
Also, you mentioned ERISA earlier, and in case you were curious or anybody else's, Employee Retirement Income Security Act.
Of what year?
Oh, it's funny is I had a feeling you'd ask that. 1974.
Correct. And I actually know that one. That one sticks with me better after teaching retirement planning at CU for a couple of years.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it then. I think it's one of those things that, right, feels, sounds sexy and interesting and new, but those things don't always lead to smart long-term decisions. So considerations of early retirement, right? There is a subsection of people out there who listen to our podcast and hear us talk about FI of the FIRE acronym, right? Financial independence, and how we support that wholeheartedly. But then maybe the retirement and the early retirement part of the acronym is a little bit, more nuanced and deserves a little bit more consideration. That being said, right, there are people who probably just want to retire early. Maybe there are some health concerns, or they've seen people in their life retire later in life and then not enjoy it to the most they could. So, like, let's say someone actually does want to retire early. So let's say 55 through 60. What has to change, or what additional considerations should they really be thinking about that maybe someone who wants to retire at 65 or later doesn't have to think about?
I mean, the biggest risk that's going to be here is going to be essentially longevity risk and inflation risk. So, a lot of retirement income studies and data, things like the 4% rule, et cetera, often hinge themselves on an assumption of a 20 to 30 year retirement time frame. And a lot of those studies, a lot of those assumptions break down the longer you make the timeline. This is sort of a classic Monte Carlo example. The longer the timeline, the more variability there is to the end result. When you're retiring at 60 or 70, you can be fairly confident that you are not going to live another 50, 60, 70 years, right? Just statistically speaking, most people who retire later die sooner, their timeline is shorter. When you retire early, you are heavily dependent on your assumptions, right? What is inflation going to be? What are the markets going to do? What are interest rates going to be, et cetera? And then you are having to stretch your dollar a lot further, right? If you know you're going to die in 5 years, your risk from longevity is greatly reduced, and your risk from things like inflation is greatly reduced. But the longer your retirement time horizon, the more important it is that you understand the level of assumption that goes into that, and the more important conservative hedging in your assumptions becomes to ensure that you don't overspend early on and find yourself needing to return to work or do something to support yourself at an age where your qualifications or your health may not make it viable.
All right, so sounds like, being dependent on these good assumptions and obviously having more savings, because you need more savings if you're going to live longer. I think it's also important, and I think that's the part a lot of people get and realize is, sure, right, if I want to retire earlier, I need more money, or I need to live off less, or a combination of both. I think something that doesn't get described or talked about nearly enough is, right, of equal importance, it's not how much you save, it's also where you save. So if you're retiring at 55, you need different accounts and to structure things differently than somebody who's retiring at 65, right? Can you maybe talk about the importance of diversifying the actual savings you do have and where you're doing that, as opposed to simply how much you need to save?
So I think this is an interesting one because you get a lot of people, I think, in sort of the financial influencer space who will really, really tout, the problem of retirement plans like 401ks. And they'll always say, like, well, you have to be 59 and a half to get your money out of your retirement plans. And it's not necessarily true. You do have the options like the Rule 55, Rule 50 for 457 plans, where you can get into it by age 55 or by age 50 in certain occupations and fields. The alternative is you go into IRAs. You have the 72T distribution, which lets you take retirement money out essentially at any point, so long as you continually distribute money from your retirement plans, up to the point where you would actually be retired. So there's ways to get out of those where it still makes sense to use Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, traditional 401ks, traditional IRAs, and so on. But if you're going to retire early, it does become more advantageous to look at things like non-retirement brokerage accounts and investment accounts, particularly because depending on your cost of living and your quality of life, you may be able to take advantage of 0% tax rates in long-term capital gains sense, based on kind of keeping your income low, particularly in these earlier years like age 50 through 60, where you're not going to be on Social Security, or you're probably not taking a pension income that's going to drive up your base level of income. So tax planning becomes another big factor in this, and that one's probably one of the hardest ones to plan for. You can sort of look at long-term averages for inflation and say, okay, if the long-term average is 3%, I'll go to 4%. But tax policy can technically change at any time, and that becomes a bigger factor and a bigger consideration in here as well. Is it's one thing to say, oh, I'm not going to pay taxes on my Roth. Nothing stops Congress from changing their mind about that. Other than political sentiment and the problems it causes, but Congress can technically do whatever it wants. So there's little things like that where we want to be mindful that diversifying the asset location of our savings for our early retirement plan becomes a little bit more important in a framework where we're not just going to retire in our mid-60s and all the rules kind of don't matter anymore.
I think one of the other big challenges, right, and it kind of ties into the question you just answered, right? So like having flexibility, whether it's for Roth conversions, capital gain harvesting, or keeping income low enough for certain healthcare subsidies. The other challenge is just healthcare, right? We spoke to someone this week who said their healthcare costs are practically going to double next year. And that's a really big concern and a really big item to plan for. It's not cheap. What's the deal there? How does somebody plan around healthcare if they want to retire at 55? Is it as simple as, yeah, it's going to be expensive, good luck, let's make assumptions for what that's going to cost? Are there ways to make it cheaper and plan around it? How do we approach that conversation with clients and plan for it?
Under the ACA framework, there's a world where you can sort of thread the needle. So, Affordable Care Act subsidies kick in so long as your income is 400% or less than the federal poverty limit for your area and for your family composition, right? Whether you're single, married, have children, et cetera. One good case study here is we have some clients who were retired about 5 years ago, had 2 children when they went through their retirement. The one spouse fully retired, the other spouse kind of worked very part-time. And they've effectively been able to pay something like a 1 or 2% tax rate for the last 5 years based on living on non-retirement accounts. And then beyond that, have essentially paid little to nothing for their health care, despite being in their 50s and having 2 children, because they've been able to qualify for either Medicaid in certain years or otherwise qualified for the full ACA subsidy, where they've been able to get like a silver quality plan essentially for free. So there's a certain arbitrage to be played in how you retire and what age you are in your family composition, where as long as you don't have severe chronic health issues where you're going to need to incur lots of healthcare expenditures on an ongoing basis, under the ACA system, there's a world where you can get your healthcare for free, live on some of your investment income and dividends in a certain way, and kind of keep yourself below certain tax thresholds and certain benefits thresholds. But if you were going to have a $150,000, $200,000 a year retirement lifestyle, whether it's early or not early, then retiring before 65 when you're eligible for Medicare does become extraordinarily expensive. And that's where it's sort of like retiring with a mortgage versus not retiring with a mortgage. It's very easy to find yourself paying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year for healthcare in your late 50s, right? Whether you have kids or not, whether you're married or not. And so that is an expense that I think, it's hard to forecast for if you're going to try to retire by 40, because maybe you're young, hale, healthy, and whole, but life happens. Accidents happen. Illnesses happen, sometimes through no fault of our own, where suddenly our plan might have relied on only having catastrophic health care coverage at a really, really low price. And 5, 6, 7 years later, we have this chronic condition where we're having to pay out $5, $10, $15, $20,000 a year, not just for insurance premiums, but also for our copays and deductibles and so on. So I think it's a risk where it's one that is almost impossible to plan for in a serious sense. And you have to really just account for that and say, okay, does my plan survive if my cost of housing double? Does my plan survive if my inflation assumptions are wrong by a factor of 2? Does my plan survive if I have to pay $20,000 to $40,000 a year more for healthcare than I was otherwise planning for? That's what makes the retiring early easy and difficult. It's easy to say I've got enough to live on right now based on my assumptions. It's hard to have forecast for all the what ifs that can occur there and for your plan to survive all the potential what ifs if all of those come to pass.
In your experience, out of the folks we've encountered who do retire early, whether financially or just, emotionally, where they find it's as fulfilling as they hoped, how many of them do you think do it successfully?
In our personal client network and people we know, what I tend to see is more micro retirements, where one spouse retires, the other one keeps working, or where one takes off a couple of years, or they just retire from their primary career to do something else. I think in the larger universe of like FIRE influencers, I think the running joke is that nobody actually does the retire early thing. They just do financial independence, and then they start a FIRE business where they sell how to do FIRE to other people. See all the influencers for FIRE and all the blogs and YouTube channels and whatnot, where they seem to have a full-time job talking about how they retired early. So I think in that sense, part of it also is, and we've talked about this before, there's a difference between retiring from something, getting away from something you don't like, versus retiring to something, finding all the free time and joy you can. Like I was listening to a podcast this morning interviewing Kevin Dahlstrom, who is a early retiree who lives over in Boulder and is, I think, reasonably well known in the world of Twitter. And he really retired to climbing and kind of living his activities and hobbies as his passions versus retiring from corporate life. And I think that's a meaningful distinction as well. It's not just about stopping work. It's about finding something to do with your time that is more important than working or building wealth in that way.
Yeah, it's well said. I think that kind of translates or transitions nicely to long-term care. It's a big assumption we have to make for not even clients retiring early, but those just retiring in a traditional sense. I want to break it down into people who can qualify for long-term care and still have the opportunity to maybe do something about planning for it. And then the alternatives for those who either have chronic conditions or simply can't afford the premiums or are past the point in which they can obtain a policy. So first and foremost, let's start with those who can qualify. When should they start having this conversation and really saying, okay, this is something I need to look into and obtain?
Oh, man, I got to say, even before I answer that question, long-term care is like the most frustrating planning area to work through because nobody wants to talk about it. If they do want to talk about it, it's almost unsolvable because something's happened in their life that now makes it more important to them. And even when you can solve for it, it always really mucks with the plan in a really unpleasant way. For people who want to think about like, when should I start this? I think your early 50s is the best time to start talking about long-term care. You can get long-term care policies earlier, right? I got my combination permanent life insurance, long-term care insurance policy when I was 28. But that's something where, I'm a financial planner. I'm thinking about that way in advance. I don't know that you need to get long-term care in your 30s or 40s, but I think in your 50s, particularly your early 50s, is sort of the sweet spot to really start considering it. And the sucky thing about that is for a lot of people, that's also going to be around the time that their kids are going to college. So then we're just talking about adding expenses on top of expenses. But that's the ideal timeline. I find that most people don't want to talk about it until they're getting ready to retire or are already retired. And in many cases, it is actually already too late.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's probably my least fun thing to include in a plan because almost every single time I know the outcome. It's you're going to have money and you're going to have more money, and then all of a sudden I turn the toggle on for long-term care and there's no money left. All right, it is a depletion of wealth more than any other event in most people's plans. It's also their least favorite thing to talk about, right? Talking about death isn't fun, but we all know we're going to pass at one point in time. long-term care is one of those things people say, well, yeah, my mother needed it and I might need it, and you're still going to be alive and it might be unpleasant. So people hate talking about it. You mentioned recently on a different podcast that we have a client that you had impressed upon them the importance of getting long-term care, and they didn't. And now they're past the point in which they will likely qualify, or if they do, it'll be considerably more expensive than if they had done it when you had recommended it. Can you just talk about that a little bit and maybe how that scenario occurred and what maybe they've learned from it and what some people on the podcast listening here could learn from it?
Yeah, and I'll just describe the overall situation here. You have a couple looking to retire, and so you build the financial plan just like Daniel described, and you have the toggle that shows, buying long-term care, and it kind of, slices off a good 10, 15% of the plan throughout the duration of the plan, right? And this is buying long-term care insurance. So it makes the plan look worse and you have less money and boo, nobody likes that. And then you show them, if you had a long-term care event, you have this insurance and there's still a dent in the wealth because long-term care insurance never is quite adequate to keep up with the cost of long-term care, but at least it hedges it. And then you say, and then here's what happens if you had a long-term care event and you didn't have the insurance, and it's devastating. It just sucks all the money out of the plan. And you present this, and the clients look at you and they go like, well, gosh, that's pretty terrible, but I didn't like how much it was going to cost in the first place. I think if we need a long-term care, we'd just jump off a cliff anyway. Ha ha ha. Like I've heard this "I will kill myself" joke more times than I can count at this point. Yet to see anybody do it, by the way. But that is just the notice. Everybody kind of goes like, well, gee, that sure is expensive. I don't like that. I don't like the long-term care thing either. But gosh, you're showing me that this will happen when I'm 97. I don't want to live when I'm 97 anyway, so I guess I'll just stop. Fast forward a couple years, they've declined to get the long-term care insurance because it was expensive, and they've gotten a little bit older, and through no fault of their own, because they've gotten a little bit older, some of the warranties have started to expire. And because the warranties have started to expire, they are now maybe a little bit more concerned about the reality of long-term care. Well, Dan, you showed this happening to us when we were 95, 97, 100 years old, but now I'm in my 70s, but my knees hurt a little bit more. My back hurts a little bit more. I'm not as healthy as I was when we had this conversation a couple years ago. Can we revisit this? Well, we can, but now at this point, we are past the underwriting age for all long-term care policies of the traditional type, and that's what you declined in the first place. And now we're left with asset-based policies, which asset-based policies are traditionally permanent life insurance policies with a very minimal death benefit and some incredibly generous long-term care benefits instead. And now we're looking at paying just as much, if not twice as much, as the original traditional long-term care policies. So then now we're faced with this coin flip decision of, do we hedge the long-term care policy or hedge long-term care risk at the cost of sucking our retirement dry before we need the care? Or do we just accept that we are going to essentially go bankrupt one day in a long-term care event if it protracts longer than was otherwise anticipated? And that's the decision, right? We have decided to not buy the insurance, and now that we were faced with the potential burning of the house down, we are suddenly very interested in getting insurance, only to find that it is now essentially a decision between going bankrupt sooner than later or deciding to just go bankrupt later. That really is the nasty conversation that happens in the back end of these long-term care conversations, all because we just wanted to joke it away at the time. So again, I say, return to what I said up at the top, I really dislike the long-term care conversation because people don't like to take it seriously. People want to have their cake and eat it too, and we all just sort of get flippant about it until suddenly it becomes a more pressing reality in our lives.
No, you explained it perfectly. We have had that conversation and continue so frequently. Oh, I'll be 97. I'll just tell my spouse to throw a rock at my head and that'll be that. Problem solved. Nobody does that. It's not really that realistic. So what do most people past the age in which they can obtain a policy do in reality, right? You mentioned they can obtain some sort of hybrid policy, asset-based, where there's a minimum death benefit and they're probably pretty expensive and it covers a lot of the long-term care costs, but not all of them. Do people actually obtain those policies in practice, or do they tend to just ride it out, go on Medicaid once they have no money left and they've depleted all their assets?
I see a lot of people forego the asset-based policy because it still has the problem of being very expensive. It is a solution. It's just not great. The other strategy then is that you try to see sort of a deliberate spend down. Okay, I'm in my mid-70s. I think I'm going to have a care need at some point. Let's just start enjoying life a little bit more. Let's start, taking more trips, living more. Let's just go ahead and get deliberately poor That sort of tends to be the approach that I see. You see some people sort of bring up the idea of like, why don't we give our family more of the money? There's ways to do this, but there's a very long 5-year look back. So then you're really trying to hedge the balance of like, okay, maybe I'm 70 years old and maybe I think I'm going to need care by the time I'm 80 or 85. So I need to like simultaneously give away a lot of money before 75 or before 80 in that case, but also still have enough to live on. So it's sort of a tightrope walking exercise that occurs there. In practice, there are some things like Medicaid qualified annuities where, particularly if there's an age differential in the household where, the husband is 5 years older than the wife, that's not an uncommon age gap that we see. Then it becomes a question about protecting the spouse who's not going to need the care so soon. And that's a little bit more tricky to effectuate than just getting poor on paper. The challenge of the getting poor on paper strategy is that you have to get very, very poor, not just on paper, but just in general. You can only have $2,000 to $3,000 left, depending on whether you're single or married. And then in that scenario, if you're married and your spouse doesn't need care, they are only allowed to retain a very nominal amount of wealth. And then, essentially you're putting them sort of in a tough financial spot to then have the government pay for your care. And by the way, government-funded care doesn't tend to be that great. We don't see a lot of people volunteering to put themselves on food stamps. Same sort of thing in long-term care. I don't know that it's a great strategy to voluntarily try to put yourself on government-funded long-term care, just from a quality of life standpoint.
Yeah, the quality varies. My grandma's got dementia, and I believe she's in one of these places in New Jersey right now. I haven't seen her in a year or so. I will when I go home for Thanksgiving. I don't think it's great digs. I don't think she's living it up in this Medicare-funded bed that are also limited, for those spots. Can you speak a little bit more about the difference between a single spouse and two spouses, right? So like if it's just me and I'm planning for long-term care, I'd probably feel a lot more comfortable saying, well, yeah, I'll spend down what I have and then that'll be that and I'll die. But if you have another spouse who's 3, 4, 5 years younger than you, that's not a really viable strategy. It's just to spend what you have and then leave them holding a bag full of nothing.
Well, and the differential there is whether they need care or not, right? If you need care and you're single, $2,000, no more. If you need and your spouse needs care, $3,000 and no more. But if there's this differential where you're healthy and they're unhealthy or vice versa, then essentially they're allowed to have their primary residence and less than $200,000. I think the exact number is like $168,000. But that essentially means, right, let's say you had a nice $500,000 retirement nest egg, going into this problem, you've got to spend $300,000+ on your own care. And let's say the age gap is 5-10 years. And let's say, it's the older man, younger woman, because that's kind of the social norm that we see in the United States. Men tend to live less time than women, and women tend to live longer than men. So if you have a case where a man is, let's say, 83, 85 years old, and his spouse is 75 years old, he might die, right, maybe by age 85, having depleted their assets down to less than $200,000. And then she may have 10, 15, 20 years of life left, where she now essentially needs to get by on less than $200,000 and hopefully, a paid off primary residence. And it's a very different financial situation than where they started, where maybe they had $500,000, $1 million, $2 million. So that's something where, not only can the age differential, the health differential, the life expectancy differential cause a problem, but again, because the cost of care is so high and because the threshold for government care is so low, you can really impoverish a family household that has a substantial difference in age, health, or means.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this conversation before, and I continue to make it a topic, right? Like, this isn't the first time we've talked about long-term care because, as you said, it's one of those high importance but low urgency items for a lot of people. So I think it's just worth continuing to have the conversation, repeat the message, because, we see far too often people do the story you said earlier, where they joke about it, and then it's not a joke, and then they can't do anything about it. And I think it's just worth having the conversation. So that's all I got. Yeah.
Well, that's a great high note to end on. So why don't we try to cheer it up a little bit, Daniel? What have you learned this wonderful, terrific Thanksgiving week and your travels to New Jersey and whatnot? What have you learned that our audience will hopefully not only learn from, but also maybe lighten the mood as we roll into Thanksgiving?
So what, you don't think bringing up at Thanksgiving long-term care with my loved ones is a fun activity?
in the same way that talking politics is probably going to go great. I think talking about people's inevitable demise or decline in health before their demise is going to really lighten the mood. So yeah, let's try something else.
I don't know. I think I have a shot if I do it with a smile. But yeah, no. I saw something on Twitter the other day. It's the classic, oh, if you pay an advisor 1% over your lifetime, here's how to do the math on what that's going to cost you. And I think today's conversation is a perfect example of how that's not perfect at all. One, it assumes without the advisor, you're doing everything perfectly. I don't even need to get to another assumption. That in and of itself is such a red flag, because think of the conversation we had today. If somebody wants to retire early, the amount of accurate assumptions they need to make and the amount of changes to the framework they need to have in where they save as opposed to simply how much they're saving is something a lot of people don't do themselves. Think of the conversation around long-term care. A lot of people know they have to plan for it. Doesn't mean they do. It's wise to have somebody who can help put that in place for you. And that's not going to necessarily build wealth, right? We're not going to look at clients' net worth year over year and say, we protected against long-term care. Congrats, you're making a lot of money. But it protects against the detrimental downside. And I think the cost of advice, even when it's not small, is really nominal compared to the outsized return of some of the enhancements put in place, but also some of the protection that protects against the catastrophic risks that people don't want to have conversations about because, it's uncomfortable. So I think, we have some job security there, but less tongue-in-cheek, I do think it highlights the importance of the work and makes it all worth it, I guess.
My favorite thing, because I know that I know the post you're thinking of here, is that he did the math wrong and had the audacity to be like, here's the equation, and then did the math wrong.
Love it.
It's classic. Have a great holiday, Daniel.
You too. Cheers.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.